questions. So we would like to step immediately to your conference, your experience, and even the title is so big and also, you know, some curious. The role of United Nations in Indonesia, and then your experience in communication, and of course also some insight how to get a career in United Nations, how to experience and work in there. As you can see, the majority are students of our university, different faculties, and thank you also for the video that was shown before. You already know something about our university. And so please try to adapt your presentation, and also take in mind that of course they have moments for having some questions, but will be both sense. So you can also ask questions to our students. And so I would like to give you one moment to try if everything is working well. And okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Marco. Thank you, Vice Rector, for the introduction. You know, when introducing you takes this long, that's a sign of only one thing, that you have become old. So it's you've done more things. Look, it's great to be here. Very clearly, you guys go to a very demanding university. Usually when I go to a university, they ask me to talk about one topic. Here, they ask me to talk about 3 topics. So I'm sure it's like that towards you also. I don't want to talk for very long, because I really want to give you the opportunity to ask questions and for us to have a bit of a discussion. Is it okay if I stand up?
Of course.
Yeah, I feel so strange sitting here. So these are the 3 topics that I was asked to tell you about. The role of the UN in Indonesia, how, you know, disinformation, what these days is sometimes called fake news, what do we do to combat that, and to give perhaps my take on what it's like to build a career in the UN. So first, about the UN in Indonesia. I'm sure most of you know what the UN is, so I won't ask that. But do you know why the UN is in Indonesia? What is its role? What is the UN doing in Indonesia? Have any of you come across the work of the UN in Indonesia? Anybody? I know we are many people, so it's not so maybe easy to speak, but okay, then we do it differently. So the UN has really 3 mandates: peace and security, humanitarian work, and development. So those of you who think the UN is in Indonesia because of peace and security, put up your hand. So nobody thinks that? That's good. Because Indonesia is a country at peace, therefore the UN is not here for peace and security. So what about humanitarian work? Humanitarian work really means to provide support to a country after disasters. So is the UN in Indonesia to do humanitarian work? Please put up your hands if you think that's the case. Okay, so some of you have put up your hands. Is Indonesia a country with lots of disasters? Yes. But maybe because of that, Indonesia is actually very well prepared to deal with these disasters. So when there's an earthquake, you know, the government knows what to do. So why maybe a few decades ago, the UN had a very important humanitarian role, it's not that important now. So then, is the UN in Indonesia because of development? Hands up those of you who think the UN is in Indonesia because of development. Okay, so I wonder if those of you who didn't put up your hand ever, is it because I speak too fast? Because the acoustics isn't great? Okay, so put up your hands if you understand me now. Okay. All right. So the UN is in Indonesia because of development, right? The UN supports the country to reach its development objectives and pursue sustainable development goals. So I try to show this to you now. So first of all, there are about 26 UN agencies who work in Indonesia. You can see the logos. I'm sure you know many of them. We have about 2,000 staff. Most of the staff is Indonesian, not foreigners. There are between 100 and 200 foreigners at any given time. I am obviously one of them. Now, the UN last year, 2 years ago, spent almost $300 million in Indonesia. Is that a lot of money? It's a lot of money for you and me, but it's very little money for a country as big as Indonesia. So, frankly, Indonesia, the main role of the UN is not to bring money. Indonesia has other sources of investment, and the UN is mostly here to bring expertise, to, help Indonesia so that particular areas of work that have been developed in other countries and have proven to be useful, Indonesia can take advantage of. So I want to show you examples of a few of these projects. This guy, a few years ago, was in prison. Do you know why? In Indonesia, people who are in prison mostly. Many of you are law students, so I realize it's maybe not a very difficult question. Is it because they killed somebody? Is it because they robbed a bank? No. It's because of drugs. And most of the time, because of what in many other parts of the world would be seen as a minor drug offense, in Indonesia they are put to jail. So I've had the opportunity to visit prisons a few times in Indonesia, and most of these young men are like you, normal boys who somehow got involved in drugs. A project that the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, does is to support the Indonesian prison system to provide vocational training to these inmates, so that when they come out of jail, they actually have other opportunities than just, end up dealing in drugs or doing something illegal. So this guy learned to be a barista, and you can see here, I visited him in his own coffee shop. Okay? So it's an example where the UN brings know-how, and then the Indonesian prison authorities implement. This guy was not in jail, or at least I don't know if he had been. It's an example of a farming project by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. We think of Indonesia as a super fertile country, and it is, right, given all the volcanoes and the humid weather. But still, about 10% of the agricultural land, the farmland in Indonesia, is what is called marginal land, not very good, just on the margin of being okay for agriculture. It can be because, like for this guy, the land is completely flat. And that means when it rains, the water stays, you cannot grow anything except rice. And rice is the cheapest commodity. You have a small plot and you can only grow rice, you won't make a living. So what this project taught this guy is how to create just a small slope in his yard or on his plot, how to dig these ditches, and in what order to plant different crops depending on the water needs of those crops. So it's, again, simple methodology that helps him make more money. This is also an agricultural project, but a very different one. So I'm going to ask you a question again. Those of you who want to become farmers, put up your hand. Who you want to work in agriculture? Okay, so we've got one guy among all of you. So imagine, what will we all eat in 20 or 30 years' time if out of 200 people, only one is a farmer? That's a problem in Indonesia and in many other countries. So the UN, in this case the International Fund for Agricultural Development, supports young people from a farming background to stay on the farm. They help them with technology so they know when their bananas ripen and can take them to the market. They help them with other technology to connect them through mobile apps to the market so they know when is the best price to sell, things like that. So again, the goal of this project is to make sure that some young people, more young people, stay on the farms than they otherwise would. This is an education project of a different kind. This photo is somewhere in West Java. You can see it's a special needs school, and what these girls are learning is how to manage their own periods. The UN Population Fund, UNFPA, has brought a methodology that it taught these teachers so that they can support these girls in becoming independent in managing their periods. Okay, so very diverse areas where the UN helps. This project comes from North Sulawesi. It's a beautiful area, Likupang, it's called. It's one of the top tourism zones as designated by the government. And what the government has done is to give these people, these women mostly, buildings to build homestays. So like a separate building on their plot to welcome tourists in homestays. But you see, they tend to be poor people who have never been a tourist anywhere. So they don't know how to deal with the tourists. So the International Labour Organization works with local universities to teach these women how to build a tourism business. And for many of these women, in fact for most of them, it's the first time in their life that they have independent income. So they need to learn about how to run a small business. They learn about marketing, hashtags on social media. And when I asked them what was the most surprising thing they learned, they told me it was that tourists want their bed sheet white. You can see here, it's white. And they don't understand, like why? My sheets that were gray or blue are just as clean. But somehow, in the head of tourists, white is associated with clean. Okay? So simple things to perhaps you who've been to hotels, but not to them. And it's a great example of how the UN complements the work of the government. The government, as you know, is very strong on infrastructure development. Human resources is just as important, because otherwise there'd be nobody to manage that infrastructure. And this project has been so successful that the Ministry of Tourism has scaled it up in all these other top tourism destinations in Indonesia. The UN is no longer involved. They do it themselves. And that's the role of the UN in a country like Indonesia, which is a middle-income country, that we bring an example, we run a pilot project, and then the government or an NGO or somebody picks it up, takes it on, and rolls it out in the country. So I chose this photo because of, many of you guys study international law. So this is related to fighting international terrorism or international smuggling. This is a training exercise by the UN to the Indonesian and the Malaysian Coast Guard in the Malacca Strait to teach them how to take over smuggling boats or boats that they suspect to be boats of terrorists. Okay? You can see these are toy guns, plastic blue. But that's, again, the idea is without causing harm to themselves and to the smugglers, take over boats. And my last example is actually also from West Java. This is in Bekasi, one of the largest industrial parks in Indonesia, where the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, works with industrial parks to be more ecologically friendly, eco-industrial parks. And so again, the idea is that the UN works with just a few of these industrial parks, as well as with the government, to change the laws, to change the incentives, so that it will be more and more in the business interests of these industrial parks to become green. And then these 3, 4, or 5 industrial parks that the UN works directly with are sort of like a proof of concept. But afterwards, it will really be for the government to roll out this idea. Okay, so next, I'd like to talk about disinformation. So if you have any questions about anything I've said before, please keep that for after. You know, disinformation has always been a problem. I mean, I'm sure people were lying to each other, you know, even in the caves. But now in the age of social media, disinformation has become a huge issue in the world. And the United Nations is taking a leading role and has come up last year with the global principles for information integrity, to which countries and different entities in the private sector can sign up and you know, implement. Basically, it's about increasing transparency, also of the revenue streams of you know, companies like Instagram and TikTok, so that it would become clear to an advertiser how their money may be spent next to content that's disinformation. It's also incentives to governments to regulate disinformation in a way that they still maintain free speech. So it's really based on a principle of what we call 3 R's, that when you face disinformation, you first have to analyze, to do research, to make sure it is disinformation. Then you have to take into account how risky it is, which mostly would depend on how many people have seen it, right? If there is disinformation that only 10 people have seen, if you start running a campaign refuting those claims, you frankly are probably going to be promoting that disinformation more to people who hadn't come across it before. But if it's being seen by many, many people, then it is worth taking action. And taking action is the 3rd R, the response. So that's sort of the model. And I wanted to show you through one example how this was put into practice by us here in Indonesia. You probably know about Rohingya refugees who arrive in Indonesia sort of, you know, over the last few years regularly. But at the end of 2023, there was a bit of a bigger wave of refugees arriving in Aceh. 70% of whom were women and children. And the reason they came is because, well, initially there was violence. They were persecuted in their country of origin, Myanmar. And then the refugee camps in Bangladesh have become unsafe and overcrowded, so they were escaping that. And they undertook very long journeys on boats across the Indian Ocean to get to Indonesia. You know, huge risk, lots of people died. So what we noticed is, unlike in previous years, in 2023, they faced a lot of hate comments online. There were, you know, hundreds and hundreds of comments against these refugees, and also against the UN. What we noticed is that these comments were not genuine, but they were generated by artificial intelligence. We knew that through a textual analysis of the words. You know, when the same kind of word, let's say, if there's a word, there are many ways to say something, but if it's always the same word that comes up to express that, then probably it's not coincidental. You know, that's an indication that it comes from the same source. Of course, they change it a bit, so it's not obvious, but it comes from the same source. So through this research, we could demonstrate that, to the contrary of what they wanted you to believe, the hatred against the refugees on social media was not genuine, but was orchestrated. There were also fake accounts of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, with all kinds of false messages. So we decided to respond from within the UN. You can see here some examples. When there is disinformation, often it's not rational. So yes, you want to provide a rational response. That's what we did, these facts about refugees, but also through emotional videos. For instance, showing these kids, very cute kids, and moms, and you know, there are all these comments that these Rohingya are not good enough Muslims. So we profiled this guy who knew the Holy Quran by heart. So things like that to combat the disinformation. We reached about 9 million people through this response. We also worked with the media, both international media and Indonesian media, to combat the disinformation about the Rohingya, that they would be economic refugees, that everything is fine in their country, that they are dirty, that they are not good Muslims, things like that. There was also Buka Mata, perhaps some of you know. It's a very popular YouTuber in Indonesia, and his video recording alone reached several million people, again, showing the truth and combating the disinformation. We also supported academic events about the Rohingya refugees, and we also contacted what at that time was Cominfo, the Ministry of Communication and Information, and they have confirmed that a lot of the information out there is untrue. Was their way of doing it, it's a hoax. So what were the results? The result of this campaign was that on Instagram, the sentiment shifted from 92% negative to 32% negative. On Twitter, we achieved similar, from 90% negative to 50% negative. On TikTok, our efforts made no difference. So we also had huge online visibility, more than 100 news articles, and as I mentioned earlier, we reached about 9 million people. So the lesson for this, for us and for you and for anybody fighting disinformation, is do not just sit and do nothing, because disinformation fills in the information vacuum. Unless you try to combat it, there'll be no countering opinions. So you have to find ways, many ways, to shoot back at the disinformation, and some of it will stick. So in the next few minutes, I wanted to talk about my career at the UN. You know, how does somebody, a person like you, end up in the UN? So I guess it starts at the bottom. I am from Eastern Europe, from a country in Hungary, and I was a journalist, and then later on a co-founder of an internet company. And at one point, I just wanted to do something more meaningful, and I applied for a job at the International Trade Center, a UN agency in Geneva. And I became first the head of digital communication there, and eventually I became the chief of communication. Then I worked there for 6 years, and then I moved to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in Vienna, so in Austria and Europe, and I became, again, the head of digital communication there. So social media, website, demonstrating and reporting on the impact of the organization. And it is through this job that I traveled to many countries in the world, including Indonesia. I think I had been here maybe 5 or 6 times before I applied for the job I currently have, which is that I am the director of the United Nations Information Center that's based in Jakarta. And, you know, I always liked Indonesia, and when this job came up, I thought it would be a nice change for me to move from what in the UN we call a headquarters location to somewhere that's more like, you know, instead of working on policy, work with real people, visit real beneficiaries, engage with students like you. So, well, here, my colleagues put here what they like of some of the work I've done here in Indonesia. You can see the very typical, you know, like Professor Marco here, you go to these rural communities, they never met a bula before, and then all the women do is kind of giggle and, you know, I really had to learn how to relate to people with whom I can't really communicate, or just communicate in a very limited way, and try to bring the UN closer to people. So the UN is no longer seen as just an institution in New York, but as you would have seen on my first set of slides, it's something that's right here in Indonesia. I also wanted Mas Ilham, who is here, where? Oh, there. Ilham, your turn to speak, because Ilham's career is much more relatable to you. So I'd like him to present how he got to the UN.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Okay, first let me introduce myself first. My name is Ilham Dwi Wijaya. I'm from United Nations Information Center. I'm also currently still a final year student. I'm majoring in international relations, and I'm from Tanjung Pura University in Pontianak, Kalimantan, if you don't know. So, I actually kind of confused what I have to say in here, because I just started my career in UN just by this September, I guess. So yeah, first I write down here earliest journey, because I don't know what I want to do yet, because at that time I'm still a high school student. But in high school student, I kind of like running family business, but not like big business. I just sell some food, like a street vendor, and also sell food in my school. And then by the time I go to college, and I join some student organization in my university. I actually joined student press club in my university, and then because of that, I got engaged with the local NGO and community. And then by that time, I was chosen to help Festival Perdamaian Ganses Pontianak, which is funded by UNDP Indonesia. I became the head committee in August and September 2022. And then I also still active in my community in Pontianak, which is called Perkumpulan Pemuda Satu Dalam Perbedaan. We work on the interfaith dialogue. I became the head of public relations. Okay, this is not related to UN, but this is how it brings me to UN. So last year in June until July, I follow this one. Oh, sorry, this is me with my community, Perkumpulan Satu Dalam Pemuda. Oh, I also forget to mention that in my earliest journey, I became the coach in Boy Scouting. And then this is also in my community, Sadap, which we visit the Vihara, I guess, at this time. And then by 2024, I was joined the UN by being online UN volunteer as support team for the UNDP project, which is called Empower You. Empower You is a project by UNDP that focuses on youth engagement that teach about the employability. So you guys can check this project in Instagram. It's called Skill Our Future. So you probably will see my face here in the Instagram. I think they also still have some kind of similar project, which is Lead Plus. Yeah. So in this period, I work as event support online volunteer, which is like just project management, and I also become like the MC or moderator kind of thing. And I actually applied for my current position here as public information volunteer last year before I joined this online UN volunteer. I applied this position in October, I guess. So, but then I still not sure if I'm chosen or not, because the email was kind of bit confusing. They said they have found another candidate that more suitable than me, but they said that my data will be saved in their talent pool. So it's not quite sure if I make it or not. And then turned out I got the call in August that I will come to Jakarta today in front of you. So yeah, I guess that's it. Maybe if you want to become engaged with UN, you can start by searching the project by UN that involving the youth. The one that I know is just our program from previous, which is Skill Our Future. You guys can check it on Instagram. And then yeah, I will soon finish my volunteer here next month. I think that's all, Pak. Thank you.
So thank you. This is what we prepared for you to start with, because I really wanted to give you the chance to ask questions. Just to say, those of you who are interested, please look us up on social media. It's mostly on Instagram. That's where we are the most active. The UN really takes youth engagement seriously. We often have questions and quizzes and competitions for young people to express their views and talk about, multilateralism and, what you do or what you can do to support sustainable development. So thank you. Back to you, Marco, and over to them.
Thank you so much. I saw already many people with the phones in their hands. I think they are already following the page or checking for information. And thank you also for your insight and your application also, something that is really useful. And when you were talking about the experience with Rohingya, I was thinking about your effort as an agency. Of course, as an agency, you have resources to identify, to also to shift the narration, to also help to understand better. And I was thinking, do the government of Indonesia do something similar? Or if something like that happened to a private citizen, that, for example, is the objective of a hate campaign or defamation, or maybe is not a private one, but is a enterprise, I don't know, about food or about a song or about something like that. Do we have the weapons to answer that? Maybe that is a question from the legal side. Is the law in Indonesia, accordingly to you or your experience, improved or not?
So Indonesia, like many countries, does have laws on disinformation. The question, like so many places, is the enforcement of that law. Freedom of speech versus causing harm. The burden of proof tends to be on those, making the accusation about harm being caused. And it is hard to demonstrate that. So very often it's not legal means, and anyway, that's not my area of expertise, but it's communication through which, you can do this. And that's all of you. I mean, all of you are on social media to make sure that you verify the information you share, to make sure that you only quote reliable sources, and that you also combat disinformation. Because, I mean, who would people listen to more? An institution like the UN or other young people? Chances are they listen to other young people more. So the voices of all of you are actually very strong.
Yes, that is also very important for you. I mean, before acting, commenting, sharing, be aware what are you doing. Be aware if what are you sharing is true, what are you listening or reading is true. Because you can ruin the reputation of someone spreading, just fake news. And speaking about spreading instead generosity, I think we have some questions already prepared. At least my class of international organization had work a little bit on that. And also other students that would like to ask some questions. Please, we have a microphone there and you can freely raise your hand and call for the microphone.
Good afternoon.
Please, first things, give your name and maybe also your studying class, and then you ask the question.
Okay, my name is Fatma Abdel Nasser. I'm from Sudan. I'm studying law. And in your presentation, you talked a lot about communication. And as a law student, I would like to ask you, in your work with organizations like the United Nations, you have dealt with issues that involve legal frameworks and policies. How important is it for legal professionals to have strong communication skills, and how can they contribute to better understanding and implementations of international law?
Thank you. That's a great question. So, you see, for lawyers, but also for specialists of any profession, if you use technical language to communicate, then only the people who already know about the subject will understand you. So it's not a good way to convince a larger public of a topic. So the key thing, in my opinion, for lawyers, and let's face it, they tend to be really bad at this, is to explain what they want to explain in words that normal people without a legal background understand. Not get lost in the jargon, not get lost in the technicalities, but talk about, I think in legal theory you call this like positivist law, which is, well, if you steal something from me, that's wrong, right? That's a non-legal language. So to think about that, to perhaps practice speaking to your friends or to your neighbors and explaining in a way they understand your thesis or whatever you learned in class that day. So, and that's going to make a huge difference for you when you are in the job, because most of the people you will speak to, unless you are an academic, are non-lawyers. And it is very important to be able to speak to them in their language. In the jargon of communication science, we call this audience-based communication. That I need to look at who my audience is and use language they understand. So to give you an example, I try to give examples that relate to young people, when I talked about the work of the UN, things I think you guys can relate to more. Okay? Does this help? Thank you.
Thank you. My name, before that, let me introduce myself. My name is Alisa Fania Gusti from Program Studi Law, class international. According to Dr. Miklos, are there any special challenge in promoting international information in a country like Indonesia, which has a society with very different culture from each other? Thank you.
Sorry, Mba, could you repeat? And look, may I ask that you guys keep quiet? I think for most of you, this is not a compulsory seminar. So if you are not interested, just leave. If you are interested, then let's listen to her. Sorry, please go again.
According to you, are there any special challenge in promoting international information in a country like Indonesia, which has a society with very different culture from each other? Thank you.
So you mean if there are any talents people should have in a country like Indonesia, which is a multi-ethnic society? That's your question. Okay. So, Indonesia is a bit like the UN, but smaller, right? In the UN, we have many countries, many cultures that talk to each other. In Indonesia, you have that within the country. And this, in my view, to be open to these other cultures, to be open to people with a different point of view, both within your country and from abroad, is very, very important. I mean, it's important for peace, because peace starts with understanding within a country and between countries. If we are tolerant and we appreciate that other people see things differently for whatever reason, because of their upbringing, because of their own situation, or simply because, you know, we are different, then that would go a long way. And, you know, that's also very important. If any of you consider international careers, that, you know, when you go abroad, there may not be sambal on the table. Similarly, the thinking that people will have will be very different than the one that you are used to. And that's normal. We have to accept that. And if you want to succeed in a multicultural kind of scene, it's good to be open to that. And then you will succeed. Okay?
Hello, I'm Hajar from Sierra Leone. I study electrical engineering. I'm not really a law student, but I would like to ask a question related to law. So, as someone who has lead communication in an organization like AIE and ITC, how do you ensure transparency and credibility when addressing complex and sensitive global issues, especially in international law and diplomacy?
So how do we ensure transparency and credibility in communication? Is that your question? Okay. So I want to give you an example of my time when I was at the IAEA. The IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's a specialized organization of the UN system. And I was there when the war in Ukraine started, when, you know, Russia invaded its neighboring country, Ukraine. And Ukraine has many nuclear power plants. In fact, some of the biggest nuclear power plants in the world are in Ukraine. Now, you know, nuclear power plants are built to withstand accident. If there's an earthquake, nuclear power plant will survive, but they are not built to withstand war. I mean, nobody thought that countries would go to war, right, and shoot at each other above a nuclear power plant, right? What if a bomb falls on the plant? Huge catastrophe. So the IAEA, and it's still doing it today, put in place, you know, huge sort of lobbying and campaign for the safety and security of nuclear installations in Ukraine. Maybe you guys remember, for a while, the Russian army occupied the Chernobyl nuclear site, right? Which is not a nuclear power plant anymore because that was an accident, but it's a site with a lot of radioactive material. To this day, the Russian army, the Russian military, is occupying the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. So, in terms of communication, what we did is that we used Twitter to communicate verified information about the way the war was going. You may remember, in the first few months of the war, Russia just kept advancing, and then Ukraine pushed back. So there was a lot of changing hands, including of areas with nuclear installations or in the vicinity of nuclear installations. So very, very dangerous. And we came under criticism because sometimes we were not the fastest ones to come out with information. And that's because we wanted to make sure that the information we publish is verified and correct. You know, a war, any war, is also a war of propaganda. So both sides wanted to push their narrative. And if we had fallen for that, we would have lost all credibility. So it is sometimes to go against one's instincts, to really quickly communicate and to verify the information, make sure it's from a reliable source. And you know how hard reliable sources are from within a war. And so we did that, and you know, the international community credited the IAEA for helping to avoid a nuclear catastrophe, and communication played an important role in that. So this is perhaps an example to answer your question. Okay? Thank you.
first of all, it's our honor to be with us today. My question, there is many challenges face United Nations in Indonesia, but my question about what is the biggest challenge face United Nations in Indonesia? Thank you. This is my question.
Say that again. The biggest challenge in what?
The challenge you face United Nations in Indonesia to achieve their goals or its goals.
In Indonesia or globally?
No, just in Indonesia in general, as a general. In Indonesia, I mean, what is the biggest challenge face United Nations in Indonesia as a general?
If it's biggest challenge? Oh, in Indonesia. Okay, okay.
In Indonesia.
Sorry. Thank you. Maybe actually it's geography. It's a huge country. My job partly is to bring the UN closer to the people. How can you do that from Jakarta with a limited budget when you cannot travel the whole country? And there are big inequalities in Indonesia, including in access to information. So for me, that's a big challenge to overcome. How I can make sure that people who don't live in big urban areas also have access to our information, can also ask questions to the UN, like you guys can ask questions now. So probably that's, the biggest challenge. The United Nations is, seen as, of course, a rich organization, but, it's not so rich. You may have heard in the news that some member states now are saying they're questioning their contributions to the UN. So how can we operate with a limited budget and fulfill our mandate?
If I can add something to this question, how United Nations is perceived in Indonesia?
So in Indonesia, actually, the UN is perceived quite well. Just last week, there was a study that came out that 73% of people approve of the UN in Indonesia, much higher than globally. But interestingly, in Indonesia, Indonesians seem to approve of many institutions, government, NGOs, media, higher than the world. Though sometimes people don't really know what the UN is doing. They know about the UN, they know about peacekeeping because Indonesia is a major contributor to peacekeeping. And I think over the last, year, unfortunately, they had the opportunity to find out what the UN is doing in Gaza, how despite the war, it's doing its best to make sure people don't starve, for instance. So it's a sad reality, but it's a reality that has perhaps over the last year helped Indonesians better understand the kind of work that the UN does in the humanitarian field.
Hello. Ambassador, you were speaking of credibility.
Thomas, introduce yourself.
Hello. Yeah.
And speaking to the mic, yes.
Let me say you are a representative of the United Nations. Although the topic, the United Nations mission in Indonesia, I can say does not favor us, the international students, but please allow me to ask out of the context of United Nations of Indonesia. Like I want to ask globally, the mission of United Nations. The United Nations, as you said, is helping the world, most of the world. Let's say, now I'm going to focus on African nations. Let's say all African nations are members of the United Nations, and that's a good thing. But you were speaking of credibility, so one may ask, why the United Nations see most of the African countries as a disguised guest instead of members of the United Nations, meaning, like Africa consists of many countries. The United Nations Security Council has 5 countries. So one may ask, why is non-African member is part of the United Nations Security Council? when they have outlined in the Universal Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in Article 1, let me start with in Article 1, equality and dignity for all. Then I will address Article 7, equality before the law. So how do you think African nation is equal to that of the big five nations in the United Nations Security Council, which is Russia? I hope you are getting me, sir. Yeah, Russia. I'm coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the big five nations, the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and others. So do you think they are good enough, or do you think they are the masters of the world to control Africa, even though we have the term independence? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Thomas, that's very relevant question, and a question that the United Nations is trying to address. But the United Nations, the decisions are made by member states, right? The current construct of the UN decision making was decided after the end of the Second World War. So the Security Council actually has 15 members, but 5 of these are the permanent members who have veto power, right? And these 5 members are, 5 developed countries. So China, okay, considers itself a developing country, but let's say 4 developed countries plus China. So the developing world in general is underrepresented. Indonesian students often ask me, why isn't there a Muslim majority country in the Security Council? You ask me, or among the permanent member states, why isn't there an African country in the Security Council, right? Other countries ask, Japan, India, Germany, some of the biggest and most influential countries in the world, why don't they have a role? And why does France do, which was once upon a time a big power? But this is not for the United Nations staff or even the Secretary General to decide. In fact, the Secretary General is campaigning for Security Council reform. But it took the world, the Second World War, to establish the United Nations. In a relatively peaceful time like what we live through now, it is, to be honest, very difficult to make a change. Just last year, there was the Summit of the Future, and an outcome of the Summit of the Future is for countries to discuss Security Council reform. How long before an African country gets a permanent seat? Or how long before the system of this veto thing is abolished? Probably a very long time. But there are changes slowly.
But
these changes
step in, sorry.
Just one thing. Cannot be done by the United Nations Secretariat. They have to be done by the member states.
Because also, this is one of my students in the class of international organization. One of the line, actually, the current majority of the country is not asking to give permanent seat to other country, but is actually to abolish the concept of permanent seat. So that is also one solution that can be considered, and the international community now is more oriented to this new solution. So there is no permanent member, not country that hold the veto power, but is a more dialoguing community. But that is also a challenge.
Yeah, right. How realistic is that? Yeah. So what the United Nations Secretary General is trying to do is try to go for more realistic solutions. And one of these is the expansion of the Security Council with perhaps other permanent members who may be permanent members but would not have veto power.
Just for a period of short time. Yeah, just for a period of short time. But I think the role of the United Nations of addressing issues that are affecting the world, that's a good thing. But at least there should be a transparency. I know it's not your job. You based only in Indonesia. Yeah, I cannot just task you to do that. But at least you are you are a representative of the United Nations. And of course, this is, the world right now is based on internet. And maybe they can hear me through this. The African members, as you said, and you made mention of developing countries, and you made mention of some powerful countries like Japan. Some people are asking, why are they not members of the UNSC? But my question is, I think it is not transparent for a continent. We are talking about a continent, not even one African country. Why a continent is not even part of the UNSC, but Asian and Asian, Europe, USA, they are representative of the United Nations.
Right. So look, in the Security Council, what I try to point out is it's not only Africa that's not represented. Other parts of the world are not represented. That's not an excuse. You're right. So what the United Nations Secretariat can do, what the Secretary General can do, he's doing. We had a Secretary General recently from Ghana, right? There are more and more senior United Nations leaders from Africa. The current Deputy Secretary General is from Nigeria. There are, within the United Nations work, more and more recognition of Africa and of Africans. But the decision-making in the Security Council, well, that's for member states to decide. And, realistically, which country would give up, or what would it take for a country to give up and dilute its own current vote or current veto right? That's the situation we are in. I mean, having said that, the United Nations has had some major achievements in Africa, in peacekeeping, for instance, also in development. Now, to what extent African governments actually cooperate, just like in other continents, varies, right? But the United Nations, Africa, in terms of development, is clearly the focus of the work of the UN. Sadly, because it's positioned as, the least developed part of the world. So there is a lot of focus on Africa. In a political level, indeed, Africa has a lot less say in decision-making because of the post-Second World War reality. Again, when the United Nations was founded, when the Security Council first met, most countries of today didn't exist. Indonesia didn't exist, right? It was the Dutch East Indies. Same for most of Africa. Ethiopia was probably the only current country in Africa that existed at the time the UN was founded. Yeah, maybe Egypt too. It's a different reality. And the UN Secretary General keeps talking about how we must change this, but it's not up to him. He can influence and he can put things forward, but at the end of the day, it's member states.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I want to say the United Nations has done a good job, because I must compliment them for that. I must give them the credit. It's actually a good global institution because it won't help us in the civil war in Sierra Leone, and more especially the peace intervention, the peacekeeping, because we are under civil war, and they help us to deal with some of the warlords, war perpetrators, and we are having a lot of civil and political unrest, and it helped Africa. It has helped Africa greatly. But anyways, I might want to see we as a representative of the UNSC or abolition of these 5 UNSC. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for your 4 questions. Please, some students are already going. I think they are also afraid because the rain. And accordingly to our schedule, we should now give the time for some quiz.
Yes, okay. So it's been a long session, I realize. So to end, Master Ilham, where are you? Come. So it's Ilham's turn again. We will have a quiz for you, and you can even win gifts. Look, those of you who have burning questions, we can discuss briefly after the session is over. Just come up here and we can still talk for a few minutes, but we don't want to keep everybody. Okay.